At gate 14 of a crowded airport, two children sat alone, backpacks slumped at their feet, eyes darting to every face that wasn't the one they were waiting for. Their mother had promised she'd be right back. Hours later, she still hadn't returned. Hunger gnawed, fear grew, and the little boy whispered, "What if she doesn't come back?" No one stopped, no one noticed, until a billionaire CEO, moments from boarding a flight to close a billion-dollar deal, looked up from his tablet and saw them. What happened next would change everything. The two siblings sat side by side on the cold plastic seats of the airport terminal, their backpacks slumped at their feet, and their wide eyes fixed on the endless parade of strangers rushing past. They had been there for hours. The announcement board flickered with flights departing for London, Tokyo, New York, everywhere but the place they were waiting to go. Their mother had kissed them on the forehead that morning, promised she would be right behind them, and told them ever to stay put. But she hadn't come back. By the time the sun dipped lower through the glass walls, the older sister had stopped asking questions out loud. She just held her brother's hand tighter and whispered that everything was going to be fine, even though she didn't believe it herself. That was the exact moment when Nicholas Hale walked into the terminal, dragging his tailored suitcase behind him, a phone pressed against his ear as he dictated numbers to his assistant. Nicholas was the kind of man everyone noticed without quite realizing why. Polished shoes, immaculate navy suit, silver cufflinks that caught the light. He moved with precision, his tone clipped, his gaze direct. To most he was untouchable, another busy executive on his way to another important meeting. But as he sat down on the row of seats near gate 14, something unusual pulled his attention away from the spreadsheets glowing on his tablet. A little boy's stomach growled loud enough to echo against the terminal glass. Nicholas turned his head and found himself looking into the frightened face of two children who had clearly been waiting far too long, far too alone. The girl was maybe 9, her dark hair pulled into a messy braid that had half fallen apart during the long wait. The boy beside her couldn't have been older than 6, his legs dangling, shoes scuffed, one lace dragging. Their clothes were clean but worn, their faces pale with hunger, and the kind of patience that only comes when a child has already learned not to expect much. Nicholas frowned. He told himself it wasn't his business. He had a flight to catch, a board meeting in Dubai, a deal worth hundreds of millions waiting on his signature. He could get up, move to another row, and forget he'd ever seen them. But instead he found himself speaking. "Are your parents here?" His voice was softer than his usual clipped tone, almost tentative. The girl's eyes flicked up at him, sharp and guarded, then away again. "Our mom's coming," she said quickly, like a rehearsed answer. The boy shifted uncomfortably. Nicholas's brow furrowed. He'd seen children left behind in airports before, but there was something in the girl's voice that struck him, a hollow certainty. She didn't believe what she was saying any more than he did. Minutes stretched into more silence. Nicholas tried to return his attention to his tablet, but he couldn't focus. Numbers blurred. The boy leaned against his sister's arm, whispering, "I'm hungry." Nicholas's chest tightened in a way he hadn't felt in years. Without another word, he stood, walked to a nearby cafe, and returned 15 minutes later with sandwiches, juice boxes, and 2 warm croissants. He placed the bag gently in front of them. The girl stiffened, wary. "We can't pay you," she whispered. "It's a gift," Nicholas said simply. He expected them to devour the food, but instead they opened the packages with a strange care, sharing evenly, passing bites between them as if this wasn't the first time they'd had to make something stretch. He sat down again, his briefcase at his feet, his flight forgotten. Something about the quiet way they ate stirred an ache he had buried long ago. Nicholas Hale had built his empire on efficiency, precision, ruthless detachment. At 42, he was one of the most powerful CEOs in the country, his face often on magazine covers, his name synonymous with success. But what no article ever mentioned was that Nicholas had once been a boy not much older than the one in front of him, waiting in places where no one came back. His father had walked out when he was 8. His mother had tried, but life had drowned her. And Nicholas had learned early how to sit still, how to swallow hunger, how to stop expecting rescue. And now, here he was, staring at two reflections of a life he had spent decades trying to outrun. "Where is your mother supposed to meet you?" he asked finally. The girl hesitated, then whispered, "She said she'd be back after she talked to someone." Nicholas's jaw clenched. The boy tugged on his sister's sleeve. "What if she doesn't come back?" The words hung in the air like a blade. The girl squeezed his hand so tightly her knuckles whitened. Nicholas knew that grip. He had held his little sister's hand the same way, decades ago, in a different kind of waiting room. His chest burned with a memory he thought he had buried forever. He inhaled sharply, then stood. "Stay here," he said, and went to find an attendant. The attendant's answer chilled him. The children's mother had been escorted away hours earlier after being caught shoplifting at one of the terminal stores. Security had taken her into custody. No one had claimed the children. No arrangements had been made. They had simply been left on those hard plastic chairs, waiting for someone who wasn't coming. Nicholas thanked the attendant, his pulse pounding, and returned to the bench. The girl was watching him with wide, searching eyes. He sat down slowly. "Your mother isn't coming back right now," he said carefully, "but I won't leave you here alone." The boy's lip trembled. The girl lifted her chin with a bravery that almost broke him. "People always leave," she said flatly. Nicholas's throat tightened. "Not this time," he said, and to his own surprise, he meant it. What followed wasn't planned. Nicholas postponed his flight, something he never did. He contacted his legal team, his private security, his network of connections that spanned courts and corporations. He stayed with the siblings through the night, through the endless questions from airport security and social services, through the paperwork that threatened to swallow them whole. He found out their names, Emily and Jack. He learned that their mother had been struggling for years, working minimum wage jobs, drowning under debt, without family to help. He learned that the children had spent nights in shelters, sometimes cars, sometimes with neighbors who couldn't keep them. And somewhere between Emily's fierce glares and Jack's quiet trust, Nicholas felt something shift inside him. These weren't just two abandoned children. They were a mirror held up to his past, and maybe a key to his future. He had money, power, influence, all the things that had once seemed like enough. But sitting on that airport bench beside two children who had no one else, Nicholas Hale realized what he truly wanted was something his empire had never been able to buy: the chance to matter in a way that couldn't be measured in stock prices or headlines. And that was only the beginning. The hours bled into each other under the fluorescent glow of the terminal lights, and Nicholas didn't once step away from the bench. He watched Emily slowly fall asleep sitting upright, her braid slipping over her shoulder, her hand still wrapped tightly around Jack's. The boy leaned against her, his small chest rising and falling in exhausted rhythm. Nicholas sat there, his tailored jacket draped over the boy's shoulders, the crisp fabric far too large but warmer than nothing. He should have been on a plane hours ago, high above the Atlantic, reviewing financial reports for a meeting that would seal a multi-billion-dollar contract. Instead, he was counting the breaths of two children he barely knew, feeling the sharp ache of memory pressing at his ribs. He remembered nights when he'd watched his little sister sleep, promising himself she'd be safe, even when he had nothing to give her but words. When morning came, social services arrived with tired eyes and overstuffed folders. The woman who introduced herself as Miss Rivera glanced at Nicholas with suspicion, scribbling notes on a clipboard as if trying to place him. "You're not a relative?" she asked. "No," Nicholas admitted, "but I stayed with them." She frowned. "That's unusual." He bit back the sharp retort that rose to his lips. Nothing about this was usual. He handed her his card, and the recognition in her eyes when she read his name shifted her demeanor immediately. Nicholas Hale. The Nicholas Hale. The one whose donations had built wings of hospitals, whose signature sat on the front page of financial journals. She blinked, recalibrating, and Nicholas saw it, power bending the room in his direction as it always did. But this time, he didn't want it for himself. He followed Emily and Jack through the sterile hallways of the airport's administrative wing, watching the smallness of their shoulders under two heavy backpacks. The caseworker explained that the children would be taken into temporary foster care while their mother's case was reviewed. Nicholas stopped walking. "No," he said flatly. Miss Rivera turned. "Excuse me? You're not separating them from each other, and you're not handing them off to strangers tonight, not while I have a say." She bristled. "Sir, with respect, this is procedure." Nicholas stepped closer, his voice steel-edged with something raw. "Then change the procedure, because I'm not letting these children disappear into a system that forgets them." Emily's gaze flicked up to him then, her expression guarded but softened by the smallest flicker of hope. Jack clutched his sister's hand tighter, his wide eyes watching Nicholas like a child tests a fragile promise. Nicholas exhaled slowly, lowering his tone. "I'll take responsibility. Place them with me until their situation is clear." Miss Rivera blinked, as if he had spoken another language. "Mr. Hale, this isn't how it works. You can't just take custody." He straightened, pulling out his phone. "Then call your director. Call your supervisor. Call whoever you need. But understand this, I don't walk away." It took hours, calls stacked upon calls, his legal team patching in, documents drafted and signed on the spot. By evening, Emily and Jack were sitting in the back of his black car, their small figures swallowed by leather seats, staring wide-eyed out the tinted windows at a city that didn't know them. Nicholas sat beside them instead of in the front where he usually rode. He handed them bottled water, offered them food, but more than that, he offered presents. He answered Jack's hesitant questions about where they were going, assured Emily that they would stay together, and promised, without hesitation, that they were safe. When the car pulled into the private drive of his penthouse, Nicholas felt a ripple of unease. His home was designed for solitude, not children. Marble floors, glass walls, art worth millions hanging in silence. The space was immaculate, curated, cold. As he unlocked the door and ushered them inside, he caught the way Emily's shoulders hunched tighter, the way Jack's voice went small. "It's so big," the boy whispered. "It doesn't feel like anyone lives here." Nicholas froze. The words pierced deeper than intended because they were true. He had built a fortress of success, but it had never been a home, until now. He led them to the guest rooms, apologizing silently for how sterile they were. His housekeeper, startled by the sudden arrival of children, hurried to prepare beds and bring warm meals. Jack's eyes lit up when he saw spaghetti, and Emily cautiously helped him twirl noodles onto his fork. Nicholas sat across the table watching them eat, and something unfamiliar stirred in him. He wasn't a father. He wasn't even sure he knew how to be one. But in that quiet dinner, watching hunger give way to laughter for the first time all day, Nicholas Hale understood that what had begun in an airport terminal was only the start of something that would change everything. The next morning, he arrived at his office later than he ever had in his career. Grace, his unflappable assistant, raised an eyebrow as he walked in with two children at his side. "Don't ask," Nicholas murmured, and for once she didn't. She simply set aside his schedule, clearing meetings with the kind of quiet efficiency that had built her reputation. Emily and Jack sat in his private office, drawing on notepads with pens far too expensive for doodles, their small voices filling the air where silence usually ruled. Nicholas looked around the room, at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, at the empire he had built brick by ruthless brick, and for the first time he questioned if any of it mattered compared to the two children whose trust was slowly, cautiously being placed in his hands. And outside, in the city he thought he controlled, the ripple of his decision was already spreading, because men like Nicholas Hale didn't make choices like this without the world noticing, and not everyone was pleased that he had stepped into the lives of two abandoned siblings who were never meant to be seen. It didn't take long for word to spread. The story of Nicholas Hale, the notoriously calculated CEO, delaying his billion-dollar deal to take in two abandoned siblings, made its way through the corporate grapevine faster than any press release could have managed. By the time he stepped into the boardroom 3 days later, Emily and Jack waiting in his office with Grace, the whispers had already reached his partners. Men in tailored suits glanced at him with thinly veiled curiosity, some with contempt. Nicholas had never cared about gossip before, but now every glance that brushed past him felt like a test. He took his seat at the head of the table, ignoring the questions lingering on their faces, and opened the meeting as though nothing had changed. Yet, as he reviewed projections and strategies, his phone buzzed quietly against the wood. A text from Grace. "Emily is asking if you'll be back for lunch." Nicholas stared at the words longer than he should have. For the first time in decades, the numbers in front of him blurred. He excused himself early, leaving his executives stunned, and returned to his office, where Jack had fallen asleep on the couch and Emily sat reading a book far too advanced for her age. She looked up when he entered, relief flickering across her face. "You came back," she whispered, as though she hadn't expected it. Nicholas swallowed hard. "I told you I wouldn't leave." What began as temporary guardianship quickly unraveled into something larger, something more complicated. Social services pushed back, citing regulations and protocols. The children's mother, detained and awaiting trial for theft, became a shadow hovering over every decision. Nicholas's attorneys filed emergency motions, his influence pressing doors open that had been closed for countless families before. He sat in hearings where judges looked at him with skepticism, challenging his motives. Was this charity? Image control? Nicholas met each accusation with steady eyes and a voice like steel. "I don't want headlines, I want them safe." Emily clung tighter to him with each appearance in court. Jack began to mimic the way Nicholas adjusted his cufflinks, small fingers twitching at invisible fabric. And Nicholas, who had once thought himself incapable of attachment, found himself rearranging his empire around the orbit of two children who had already begun to remake his life. But not everyone welcomed the change. In the shadows of boardrooms and back channels, enemies stirred. A rival executive, Victor Crane, saw Nicholas's distraction as weakness. For years, Victor had waited for an opening to undermine Hale Enterprises, and now he had one. He leaked stories to the press about Nicholas's impulsive decision, feeding speculation that the empire was cracking under sentimentality. Reporters camped outside Nicholas's penthouse, hungry for a glimpse of the children. One evening, as Nicholas tucked Jack into bed, an act that still felt strange and yet undeniably right, his phone rang with Grace's urgent tone. "Victor just filed a motion to review your suitability as guardian. He's using the children to destabilize you." Nicholas's jaw hardened. For a man who had spent his life turning every threat into fuel, this was different. This wasn't about money or power. This was about Emily and Jack, about promises whispered in airport terminals and spaghetti dinners that had felt like salvation. He sat awake long after the children had fallen asleep, the city glittering beyond the glass walls. For the first time in years, Nicholas wasn't thinking about profit margins or market strategies. He was thinking about bedtime stories, about the way Emily's hand trembled when she trusted his, about Jack's laugh when he managed to beat Nicholas at a board game. He was thinking about the cost of protecting them, not in dollars, but in every corner of his life that would have to change. And when dawn came, Nicholas Hale made a decision. The man who had once built an empire out of ruthless ambition would now use every ounce of that same fire for something far greater. He would fight Victor Crane. He would fight the system. He would fight anyone who dared threaten the two children asleep down the hall. For the first time in his life, Nicholas Hale wasn't fighting for himself. He was fighting for family. The first clash came in court. Victor Crane had leveraged his connections to demand a formal review of Nicholas's guardianship arrangement, cloaking it in language about child welfare and stability. But everyone in the room knew what it was: a calculated strike. Nicholas entered the courtroom in his usual precision, dark suit, crisp tie, but this time Emily walked beside him, her hand in his, Jack clinging nervously to his other side. The sight silenced the whispers that usually followed him. For once, Nicholas wasn't a CEO commanding headlines. He was a man showing up for two children who had no one else. The opposing counsel painted Nicholas as reckless, too consumed by business to care for children. "Mr. Hale may have resources," the attorney said smoothly, "but parenting requires presence, not just power." Nicholas rose slowly, his voice calm but resonant. "Presence is exactly why I'm here. These children have been abandoned by a system that should have protected them. They don't need perfection. They need someone who won't walk away. And I won't." The judge studied him for a long moment. It wasn't a final ruling, but Nicholas could feel the balance shift. Emily squeezed his hand under the table, and when he glanced down, her eyes weren't guarded for once. They were shining with something dangerous, something that pulled at the deepest part of him: belief. But outside the courtroom, the war escalated. Victor orchestrated smear campaigns, planting headlines questioning Nicholas's motives. Photos of Emily and Jack splashed across tabloids, twisting their story into spectacle. Nicholas's empire wavered under the weight of scandal. Investors called for reassurances. Some board members demanded he step back. Instead, Nicholas doubled down. He shifted operations, delegating power he had never trusted anyone else with. Grace became his right hand in more ways than before, holding the business steady while Nicholas shielded Emily and Jack from the storm. Nights were spent not on strategy calls but reading bedtime stories, soothing nightmares, building walls of comfort around two children who had only ever known uncertainty. It wasn't easy. Emily still woke some nights, whispering that people always leave. Jack flinched when strangers raised their voices. Nicholas, for all his power, often felt helpless against wounds he couldn't see. Yet slowly cracks began to heal. Emily laughed at one of his dry jokes, unguarded and real. Jack fell asleep, curled against his side on the couch. Nicholas found himself lingering in those moments, realizing they mattered more than any victory he had ever claimed in boardrooms. And then came the call that threatened to undo it all, their mother's attorney filing for custody. Despite charges still pending, she wanted her children back. The law would listen. Nicholas stood in his penthouse staring out at the skyline, Emily and Jack asleep down the hall, and felt the weight of the battle ahead press against his chest. He wasn't their father. He wasn't even their blood. But he was the one who had promised not to leave. For a man who had once believed love was weakness, Nicholas Hale now understood the truth. Love was the fiercest weapon of all, and he was prepared to wield it against anyone, even the law itself, to keep the two children who had already become his family. The custody hearing drew more attention than any corporate merger Nicholas had ever signed. Cameras lined the courthouse steps, reporters shouting questions as Nicholas guided Emily and Jack through the crowd with steady hands. Grace walked at his side, a silent fortress against the noise. Inside, the air was charged with tension. Their mother sat at the plaintiff's table, her eyes darting nervously, a public defender whispering in her ear. Nicholas studied her quietly, thin, frail, haunted by choices that had collapsed around her. She wasn't a monster. She was a woman crushed by circumstance. But the question wasn't whether she loved her children. It was whether she could protect them. The state's attorney argued that Nicholas was overstepping, that money couldn't replace maternal bonds. Nicholas's own lawyer countered with evidence: the abandonment at the airport, the criminal charges, the unstable living conditions. Still, Nicholas knew this wasn't just a case of evidence. It was about perception. The judge needed to see not a CEO flexing power, but a man standing for two children who had no one else. When it was his turn to speak, Nicholas rose. "Your Honor, I didn't come here because I wanted children. I came here because two children needed someone. They were left alone in an airport terminal, hungry, scared, forgotten. I sat down beside them, and I made a promise that I wouldn't walk away. Everything I've done since has been to keep that promise. I can give them food, shelter, safety, yes. But more than that, I can give them what no one else has, certainty that they will never be abandoned again." The courtroom fell into silence. Even the opposing counsel paused, his next argument faltering. Emily's small hand slipped into Nicholas's where he stood, her chin lifted with quiet defiance, as though she were saying without words, "He's telling the truth." The judge didn't deliver a ruling that day, but Nicholas could sense the tide turning. Yet he also knew the fight was far from over. Outside, reporters pressed closer, flashes blinding, microphones thrust forward. One voice rose above the rest. "Mr. Hale, is this about charity, or are you trying to build an image as a family man for business?" Nicholas stopped, his jaw tight, and turned toward the crowd. "This isn't about business. This isn't about image. This is about two children who deserve a chance at a life they were almost denied. And if that makes me look weak to some of you, so be it." That night, back at the penthouse, Nicholas found Emily sitting awake on the couch, knees pulled to her chest. She looked at him with searching eyes. What if the judge makes us go back? The question pierced deeper than any attack Victor Crane could launch. Nicholas sat down beside her, pulling her close. "Then I'll still be here. No matter what happens, you won't lose me." Jack stirred in his sleep down the hall, murmuring Nicholas's name in a dream. And in that quiet moment, Nicholas realized he wasn't just fighting for guardianship, he was fighting for the right to give Emily and Jack what no one had given him, a home that couldn't be taken away. But even as he held on to that resolve, Victor Crane prepared his next move, an attack not in the courtroom, but in the very empire Nicholas had built, threatening to strip away everything he had in order to weaken him where it hurt most. Victor Crane's move was as ruthless as it was calculated. While Nicholas fought for custody, Victor launched a corporate assault designed to fracture Hale Enterprises from within. Anonymous leaks hit the financial press, hinting at instability in leadership, questioning whether Nicholas's personal distractions made him a risk to shareholders. There were whispers of a clandestine acquisition Nicholas had supposedly botched, of a sovereign fund pulling out of a partnership, of a rumored federal inquiry, each lie dressed in enough truth to make investors sweat. By the time the markets opened on Monday, Hale's stock had dipped 6%, and the phone on Grace's desk wouldn't stop ringing. Nicholas stood at his office window as the city unspooled beneath a sky the color of steel. Emily and Jack were in the conference room with a tutor Grace had conjured out of thin air, working through reading exercises and multiplication tables. Nicholas listened to the muffled laughter filtering through the glass and felt the old instinct to strike, to kill a threat before it took root. That instinct had once made him dangerous. Today, it just made him precise. "Turn it off," he said as the financial network on the wall spun another panel about his personal life. Grace took the remote without looking at the screen. "Victor's seeded at least 3 outlets. I've traced 2 of the reporters to a PR house he's used for hostile takeovers." Nicholas nodded. "Pressure points?" "He's leveraged through Brightshore Capital on an options position. If the stock keeps sliding, he wins and looks like a profit. He's also courting 2 of your more cautious board members, with stability packages that read like surrender." Nicholas's jaw tightened. He had built Hale Enterprises on infrastructure most people never saw, ports and fiber and energy grids braided together behind the spectacle of product launches and polished keynotes. It was the kind of empire that attracted men like Victor, men who didn't make, who only took. Nicholas pressed his thumb against his temple, felt the pulse there, steady. "Call an emergency board session, closed door today." Grace hesitated. "What about court?" I'll be back in time for the afternoon hearing." He looked toward the conference room. Emily sat straight-backed at the table like small steel, correcting Jack when he mixed up his 7s and 8s. Nicholas had learned to read her tells, the way her shoulders tensed when she anticipated bad news, the way her eyes slid to the door every time he left a room. He had earned the right to leave only when he promised to come back. "I'll get the board in," Grace said. "And Nicholas, Victor's not the only story. The children's mother has a new attorney, not the public defender." Nicholas turned. "Who?" "Someone you know, or at least someone who knows you. Maya Lynn." He searched the name and found an image. Coal-black hair, uncompromising eyes, a reputation for surgical precision in complex litigation. She'd once dismantled a class-action defense Nicholas had bankrolled against a competitor, not for a payout, but because the truth offended her. He had admired her work, even from the other side of the courtroom. "She's not cheap," Nicholas said. "No," Grace agreed, "which means someone else is paying." Victor, Nicholas thought, buying compassion he didn't possess. "Find out how much she knows," he said quietly, "and what she wants." The board assembled at noon. 12 people who understood how to extract value from chaos and who were deciding, in that moment, whether their faith was a commodity to be traded. They sat around a table of dark walnut polished to a mirror. Victor's proxies wore expensive smiles. Nicholas didn't bring charts. He didn't bring a deck. He walked in with a single page of numbers and a spine that wouldn't bend. "You're here because Victor Crane would rather take a slice of this company than build one of his own," he began, voice even. "You're here because he is wagering that I care more about 2 children than I care about keeping him out of our house. He's right about the first thing, he's wrong about the second." A few chairs creaked. He let silence bite down for a moment, then placed the single page on the table and slid copies to each director. Liquidity position through Q4. Contingency credit lines already negotiated and dormant. Cross-insurance structures tightened last year in anticipation of a rate shock. "I don't run this company on press cycles. I run it on cash and redundancy. We are solvent, insulated, and stronger than our price implies. If any of you has a question about the underlying business, ask it now." They didn't. Numbers had a way of drowning gossip. "Our exposure," one director said, carefully neutral, "is reputational." Nicholas inclined his head. "Reputation is the most manipulable currency on earth. Victor will spend his until he has none left. We will not spend ours. We will say nothing we can't measure, do nothing we can't defend, and we will not feed a story with quotes that exist only to be twisted. We are not in the business of theater." "And your situation?" another asked delicately, meaning Emily and Jack without daring to say their names. "My situation," Nicholas said, "is a promise I intend to keep." A pause. Then a voice from the far end of the table, older, seasoned, the lead independent. "What do you need from us?" "Patience," Nicholas said, "and the courage not to mistake noise for signal." He adjourned the meeting without a vote. He didn't need one. People who lived by numbers recognized certainty when it walked into a room. As he left, his phone buzzed, a text from Grace. "Miss Lynn requested a meeting. No press, no posturing. She says it's personal." Nicholas replied, "My office, 30 minutes." He arrived to find Emily standing at the glass, her breath fogging a small circle on the window, a sticky note pressed to it, as if she were trying to stick the city in place so it wouldn't leave. Jack sat under the conference table fort he'd built with pillows, whispering a story to his stuffed bear. Nicholas crouched, tugged at the cushion until Jack giggled, then kissed the top of his head. "I'll be next door for a minute," he told Emily. "Okay," she said, as if the word cost her a little less than it had yesterday. Maya Lynn stepped in like a blade. She didn't sit. "You're not the villain in this," she said without greeting, "but you're not the hero either. Not yet." Nicholas gestured toward a chair. "What do you want?" "I want the truth. About why their mother was caught shoplifting, about the weeks before that arrest, about a manager who cut her hours illegally when she refused him things that weren't in. The job description." Maya's eyes were flint. "Do you know the most expensive thing about being poor, Mr. Hale? How much time it takes. Time spent waiting for buses that never come. Time spent in lines for paperwork that's designed to defeat you. Time spent begging a landlord to fix heat he never fixes. She was late to a shift she had to beg to keep. She had 5 minutes to feed 2 kids and get back to her register. So she took a sandwich, and the store called security." Nicholas felt something old and sour stir, the particular flavor of a system that broke people in ways that never made headlines. "And the manager?" "Transferred the day after her arrest," Maya said crisply. "He works for a chain owned by a private equity fund that just happens to be one of Victor Crane's favorite toys. He'll vanish into a different store now, which is why I'm not here to talk about charity. I'm here to talk about terms." Nicholas watched her closely. Whose terms? The children's? Maya sat at last, setting down a file with gentle precision, as if it contained something fragile. "Their mother's case is winnable, if I can prove coercion and retaliatory scheduling. But even if she's cleared, she can't take them home tomorrow. She has no home, she has no job, she has nothing but a love that hasn't paid a bill in a very long time." "What does she want?" Nicholas asked. "Time," Maya said. "And a plan. Housing that isn't a motel by the week. A job that doesn't set her up to fail. Child care while she rebuilds. Supervised visits, increasing over months, with a review in half a year. In the meantime, you keep them safe. Not on paper, really safe. No cameras in their faces, no optics, no brand." She held his gaze. "Can you do that?" "Yes," he said without thinking. "Then, and what does Victor want with her?" "To use her," Maya said simply. "To make you look like you're stealing someone's children for sport. He doesn't need the mother to win. He just needs you to look like you're losing." Nicholas thought of Emily's hand in his, of Jack's small voice saying the penthouse didn't feel like anyone lived there. He thought of all the rooms in his life that were too cold, too quiet, too perfect. "I'm not playing for optics," he said. "Draft the plan, I'll fund it, and we'll put it before the judge together." Maya regarded him as if she were measuring how much of that was posture and how much was spine. "If you make her a promise, you keep it," she said. "I know," Nicholas said, and surprised himself with the softness in his voice. "I learned that in an airport." The afternoon hearing felt different, not easier. Truth rarely made anything easier, but cleaner. Maya laid out the pattern of retaliation with the precision of a scalpel, the judge's eyes hardening at every documented text, every schedule change that screamed punishment. The prosecutor, confronted with a mess that smelled like a case he did not want to try, shifted from thunder to truce in under 10 minutes. Nicholas's attorney presented the interim plan. Housing secured that day. A job with a reputable partner who owed Nicholas nothing, and therefore everything. A small logistics firm whose female CEO had built herself from the ground he recognized. Licensed childcare, supervised visits arranged through a center with couches and books and coffee and dignity. A 6-month review. No shortcuts, no secrets. The judge read the plan twice, then looked over his glasses at Nicholas. "You understand," he said slowly, "that this is not a performance. This is a life. 2 lives." Nicholas held that gaze and nodded once. "I do." The gavel didn't bang. Judges save drama for television. But the order came through before they left the building, and Nicholas felt the air around him change. Not like victory, but like the first good breath on a mountain after a long, hard climb. Outside, cameras were waiting, as they always were now. Nicholas lifted a hand for silence he knew he wouldn't get and said only, "No questions. Please respect the children." Then he turned his back on a world that fed on the pain of people who didn't have publicists and guided Emily and Jack into the car. They drove to a small brick building with a cheerful yellow door and a sign that read, "The Nest." Inside, a room painted the exact shade of mourning held shelves of toys and a rag rug that stubbornly refused to lie flat. The visitation supervisor introduced herself with a smile that didn't apologize for its warmth. Emily hovered at the threshold like a soldier testing a minefield. Jack pressed his forehead to the glass pane in the door until his breath fogged a circle. Their mother stepped in from the opposite hallway, hands shaking around the strap of a thrift store purse. Her eyes flashed over Nicholas before landing on her children with a kind of hunger that had nothing to do with food. "Em," she whispered. "Jack." The boy tore across the room before anyone could stop him and flung himself into her arms. Emily stood frozen for 2 heartbeats, watching like a sentry, then walked forward, carefully, and wrapped herself around them both. Nicholas felt something pull in his chest, a thread connected to a piece of him he didn't often look at. He took 2 steps backward and found Maya at his shoulder, watching the reunion with an expression that suggested she knew how many places in the city had never seen a moment like this handled well. "She loves them," Maya said. "I never doubted that," Nicholas answered. "Loving them isn't the same as keeping them safe." "It might be," Maya said, "with help." They stood together in the quiet corridor. Maya's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, then tucked it away. "For what it's worth, Victor's already pivoting. Leaked a story about you arranging the job to buy influence with the court." Nicholas almost smiled. "Of course he did. What do you plan to do?" "What I always do," Nicholas said, and thought of a boy version of himself, sitting in a waiting room decades ago, memorizing the sound of a clock because it was the only thing he could control. Build something that outlasts the noise. That night the penthouse didn't feel quite so cold. The housekeeper had found a second-hand upright piano, and delivery men had scuffed the immaculate elevator pads moving it in. It sat against a wall of glass now, the city twinkling beyond it like a second set of keys. Emily ran a cautious finger along the wood and then, as if testing the edge of a secret, pressed a single note. It rang clear as a bell. "Do you play?" Nicholas asked. She shrugged. "At school, sometimes, when they let us." "In the music room?" "Then it's yours," he said. "This one is, anyway." He pulled the bench out. She sat sideways at first, as if prepared to bolt. Then she turned to face the keys, planted both feet like a resolution, and began to pick out a melody Nicholas recognized only as Hope with Corners. Jack crawled under the bench, made a fort of Nicholas's knees, and fell asleep there beneath the slow, halting notes. Morning brought war again. Victor's latest move was elegant and poisonous, a concerned investor's letter calling for an interim executive chair to provide stability while Nicholas attended to personal matters. The letter hit inboxes at dawn, leaked within minutes, then bloomed across the financial press with the speed of contagion. Nicholas read it once and felt nothing. Then he printed it, folded it along the crispness of its intent, and slipped it into his inside pocket. He dressed Jack, knotted Emily's laces, walked them into the kitchen where someone had learned how to make pancakes without burning them, and let the smell of actual breakfast rewrite the first hour of the day. "You'll be here after school?" Emily asked, trying to make the question sound like something else. "I'll be here at 3, he said, "and if I'm not, you have permission to call me every 2 minutes until I answer." She tried not to smile and failed by a millimeter. When they were gone, Grace shepherding them downstairs with the quiet ferocity of someone who had never been allowed to keep anything and had decided to keep this, Nicholas turned to the only task that mattered. He called the lead independent again. "Schedule it," he said. "Full board. I'm putting this to a vote." In the hour before the meeting, he did something he had not done in 20 years. He went to see his sister. She lived in a small house 30 minutes from the city on a street that remembered trees. They hugged like people who used to share walls and now shared only stories. She looked at him with eyes that knew everything and asked nothing. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," he said after a while. "For what?" She laughed softly. "For surviving with teeth? For not coming sooner, for forgetting what a promise feels like when you're the one waiting for it." She touched his cheek. "You were a kid carrying cement. You set us both free. Don't rewrite that." On the way out, she pressed a photograph into his hand. 2 children in a bus station, a boy with a jaw already learning hardness, a girl whose hand disappeared into his. He slid it into his wallet behind the letter he intended to bury. The boardroom was colder than usual. Victor's proxies had multiplied. The lead independent cleared his throat, read the letter's demand, then turned to Nicholas. "You asked for this vote," he said. "I did," Nicholas said, "and before you cast it, I want you to know the facts. Victor's short position is levered across options that expire in 9 days. His campaign is designed to depress our price long enough to realize that win. Our liquidity is unaffected, our operations are sound, our customers are growing. The only variable he can manipulate is narrative." He placed the photograph on the table beside the letter. No one but the lead independent could see what it was, and that was fine. It wasn't for them. "In my first year building this company," Nicholas said, "I slept on the floor of an office with duct-taped carpet. I made payroll by negotiating net 60 with people who hated me for asking and loved me when I delivered. Nothing I have done since required more courage than those months." He took a breath. "Until now." He glanced toward the door as if he could see through floors and elevators to where 2 children were learning there was such a thing as a person who kept his word. If you want a figurehead who will abandon a promise to protect our price for a quarter, vote for an interim chair. If you want an operator who will protect this company by building a future that can't be shaken by rumors or men who profit from ruin, vote to stay the course. And if you want to fire me, do it to my face, and understand that I'll show up at 8 tomorrow morning to help the person you hire find the light switch. Something like a smile touched the lead independent's mouth. The vote was held. It wasn't unanimous, nothing worth having ever is, but it was decisive. The letter went into the minutes and nowhere else. When Nicholas stepped out of the building, the day had softened. He drove through the traffic that seemed less like a test and more like a river. At 3, he was waiting outside the school, a man in a suit leaning against a car that did not quite fit in a line of minivans. Jack barreled into him, chattering about a clay volcano. Emily walked slower, then broke into a jog she would later deny had ever been a run. "Did you come early?" she asked, surprised. "I came when I said I would," he answered. Over the next weeks, the new order learned the shape of itself. Emily started piano lessons with a teacher who didn't talk down to her. Jack joined a soccer team and learned to laugh at the grass stains that ruined Nicholas's schedule more than his suits. Nicholas read contracts at kitchen tables while supervising glue projects that got everywhere. He took work calls standing in hallways outside music rooms. He listened to bedtime confessions about monsters and memories and learned that his voice could make someone else's fear smaller. The visits at the Nestor grew. Their mother, her name was Lena, stopped shaking by the 3rd week. She arrived with homemade cookies and a new haircut, and stories about her training at the logistics firm. She learned how to stack pallets and how to say no without apologizing for existing. She made mistakes. She learned. She cried twice, and both times Emily crossed the room and put a hand on her wrist like a bridge. Maya visited often, not because she had to, but because she had learned that some cases need witnesses as much as they need attorneys. She and Nicholas argued about semantics and systems. She told him when his generosity felt like control. He told her when her principles risked becoming cages. They both laughed more than either expected. Victor did not stop. Men like him never did, but his options expired, the stock corrected, and the appetite for his stories dulled when he couldn't feed them a climax. He still lived in the dark corners of the business, but he didn't own the light. 6 months passed like water. On the day of the review hearing, Emily wore a blue dress that Grace had insisted was lucky, because it made her eyes out-argue the room. Jack carried a plastic dinosaur in his pocket because he believed in small talismans. Lena walked in a woman rebuilt, steady, tired, unbroken. Nicholas sat beside Maya, who slid a file toward him without looking away from the front of the room. "What is it?" he whispered. "A letter," she said. "From Lena. You can read it later." The judge listened to progress reports, to school updates, to a visitation supervisor who talked about a mother who had learned to be present without making her children parent her. He listened to a teacher who said Emily argued with piano the way some lawyers argued with words. He listened to a coach who said Jack sometimes hung back from the ball and then, when he chose to, charged like a story he believed in. He listened to Maya's synthesis and to Nicholas's simple truth. "I'm here." When the judge spoke, he did so in the careful cadence of someone laying stone. "Children are not prizes to award for virtue or to punish for failure," he said. "They are people who depend on our best selves despite our worst days. This court is not in the business of choosing winners. It is in the business of building structures where love and safety can coexist." He laid out a plan that did not fit into a headline. Shared legal custody, physical custody with Nicholas for the next year while Lena continued to stabilize, with overnights expanding on a schedule designed for the children's nervous systems, not adults' pride. A standing order about privacy that would bury anyone who tried to make Emily and Jack into content. A review at 12 months that would consider not who loved best, but what worked. Outside the courthouse, Nicholas didn't stop for cameras. He guided Emily and Jack to the car, buckled them in with the competent awkwardness he had acquired, and drove to a park that had existed long before headlines learned their names. They ate ice cream on a bench, baked warm by a sun that did not care about men who traded in fear. That evening, while Jack fell asleep in a fortress of pillows and piano notes and relief, Nicholas stood at the kitchen counter where paper had replaced marble's empty shine. He opened the envelope Maya had slipped him. The letter was handwritten in careful looping script. "Mr. Hale, I don't have the words people use in court. I only have the ones I know from living. I grew up in places that taught me leaving is what love does when it gets scared. I don't want to teach that to my kids. You sat with them when I couldn't. You fed them when I was too proud to ask for help. You didn't paint me as the worst version of myself and call it truth. That matters. If there is a day when they are old enough to choose where to be without a judge telling them, I hope they choose from a table where there is room for all of us. Until then, thank you for building one. Lena." Nicholas folded the letter with a care he didn't waste on things that didn't deserve it, and slid it into his wallet beside the photograph of a boy and a girl in a bus station. He stood there a long moment, hands flattened against the counter, breathing in a house that now sounded like someone lived there. He didn't hear Emily come into the kitchen. She set her hands beside his on the counter, mirroring without knowing. "Is it okay?" she asked. "It's more than okay," he said. "It's ours." She nodded like a small executive approving a merger between her heart and his word. Then she tilted her head toward the piano. "Grace says you can't play anything that isn't chopsticks." He made a wounded sound. "Grace is a liar." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Prove it." They sat at the bench. He didn't know where to put his hands, so she placed them for him. They stumbled, laughed, made a mess of a melody that might have been a song if you were generous. It didn't matter. The room filled with a sound that was not money or victory or headlines. It was the sound of a promise turning into a day, into a life. Months stretched into seasons. Lena found an apartment with a lease and a plant she didn't kill. The job became a promotion, became not a miracle, but proof that a system could be forced to bend. Maya moved on to another case that required spine and kindness in equal measure, but came by on Saturdays with pastries that tasted like justice done right. Grace learned how to say no for Nicholas in ways that made yes bigger. Victor found another target and eventually a mirror. Emily played the piano like she meant to negotiate with it until it gave her everything she asked for, which was how she approached the world. Jack's dinosaur evolved into a collection, which evolved into a science fair project that took over the dining table and won second place because the judge had taste but not vision. Nicholas learned how to get mustard out of silk and how to say, "I'm sorry," without a board vote, and how to look at the clock without remembering that waiting was a disease. He learned that being a father wasn't a title you purchased or a role you auditioned for. It was a verb. It was 1,000 small tasks done when no one was watching and 1,000 small choices to stay. On a spring afternoon a year after the airport, Nicholas found himself back in a terminal, not because the story required symmetry, but because life does. They were not waiting on a bench this time. They were a family of 4, because Lena had started to join them for certain rituals that mattered more than court orders, taking Emily to a music competition in another city. Jack tugged at Nicholas's sleeve and pointed at a vending machine. "Do we have time for snacks?" "We have time for everything," Nicholas said, and realized it was true. They passed gate 14. On the row of seats that had once been an altar to abandonment, a man in a suit was scrolling through his phone, while a little girl sat beside him, swinging her legs. She dropped her stuffed rabbit. The man didn't notice. Nicholas stopped, bent, picked it up, and handed it to the girl with a smile that made her stop swinging. "Hold on to her," he said. "Airports are tricky." The man looked up, embarrassed, pocketing his phone. Nicholas nodded. They moved on. The announcement board flickered with places they could go, lives they could have lived. Nicholas felt Emily's hand slide into his, and he tightened his fingers without slowing. They boarded when called. The plane lifted into a sky rude with light. Emily leaned against the window, recording clouds the way other people record birthdays. Jack fell asleep with his mouth open and his dinosaur wedged between the seat back and the dream he was having. Nicholas looked across the aisle at Lena reading a book someone had recommended because it contained a woman who refused to apologize. He looked at the 2 children who had taught him the difference between empire and home. He closed his eyes and breathed. The man he had been would have said that love was a liability. The man he was knew that love was infrastructure, the hidden lattice that holds up the city of a life when storms arrive. He had built one kind of network for the world and another for himself, and only one would matter when the lights went out. The flight attendant paused at their row with a tray of cookies. "Compliments of the captain," she said, grinning like an accomplice. "He says thank you for the new fiber line at the West Terminal." Nicholas laughed. Emily rolled her eyes and said, "You work everywhere?" "Only where infrastructure needs a friend," he said. She pretended to be unimpressed. He let her. It was a good game. Later, as the plane cut through a pocket of turbulence and the cabin whispered with fear, Jack woke and reached blindly. Nicholas's hand was there. Emily glanced at him, and he nodded once, and the plane flew on. At home that night, after the music competition and the late dinner and the laundry that never made it to the dryer until morning, Nicholas stood again at the piano. The city hummed beyond the glass like a promise that no longer tempted and no longer threatened. It simply existed, a place you lived instead of a thing you conquered. He set Lena's letter beside the photograph in his wallet and closed it with a click. From the hallway, feet scuffed, sleepy and uncoordinated. Emily put her chin on the piano lid. "Play something," she said. "Bossy?" he murmured. "Accurate," she replied. He touched the keys. The first notes were awkward, then less so. It wasn't chopsticks. It wasn't anything you'd recognize if you didn't know the story. But if you did, if you had ever sat on a hard plastic chair and waited for a world that didn't owe you anything, you'd know exactly what it was. It was the sound of a man who used to measure his life in deals and deadlines, learning a new math. It was the measure of 2 children growing not out of fear, but toward light. It was the quiet, relentless music of a promise kept, played on a piano someone had dragged into a house that needed to learn how to be a home. Outside, the city blinked. Inside, the notes climbed and settled and climbed again. And in the space between them, where breath lives, where belief lives, where the choice to stay lives, Nicholas Hale sat beside the life he had chosen and let it change him without asking permission. Summer did not ask permission before it remade their routines. It just arrived. All warm sidewalks and late sunsets and the sound of the piano drifting out of open windows, as if the city itself had decided to hum along with Emily's stubborn melodies. And in that ordinary season, Nicholas discovered that the life he was building was not fragile after all, but sturdy in a way he hadn't trusted anything to be. It held through dentist appointments and school forms and the unremarkable heroism of packing lunches at 6 in the morning when he used to be negotiating markets in 3 time zones. It held through board memos that now included lines like coach pickup at 4:30 and do not schedule past 3 p.m. on Thursdays. It held through the day. Jack brought home a paper dinosaur so lopsided it looked like a green thunderstorm and insisted they tape it to the refrigerator at eye level so it could watch over dinner. And Nicholas, who had always curated his world into sharp edges and perfect lines, decided crooked could be beautiful if it meant a boy felt safe enough to command a ridiculous guardian for the kitchen. He told no one how often he stood at that refrigerator after the house had gone quiet and read the weekly menu written in Emily's careful hand, as if the sheet of paper were proof that families could be assembled from wreckage, because there were still moments he feared he would turn a corner and find the terminal again, find the plastic chairs and the hollow of waiting, and the only antidote he'd found for old ghosts was to inhabit the new rooms completely. It was Grace who knocked those rooms into still greater clarity when she slid a folder across his desk with the no-nonsense efficiency of a woman who saved her boss's life 3 times before lunch and considered it a quiet morning. Crane's taking a swing at the nest, she said. And Nicholas understood immediately that Victor had finally learned not to strike where Nicholas was expecting him, in share prices or headlines, but at the place Nicholas had made vulnerable on purpose, the visitation center with the yellow door and the rag rug that stubbornly refused to lie flat. A smear of online insinuations had begun to bloom. That the nest funneled donors into private contracts, that families were coerced into custody arrangements, that it was an elegant shell for influence. The names behind the accusations were burner accounts that smelled like money laundering and resentment, and Nicholas's legal team could swat them out of the air. But the timing was precise, 2 weeks before the year review hearing that would decide whether Emily and Jack's schedule shifted again. Nicholas read every line without blinking, then closed the folder and said, "We will not counterpunch in public. We will document and invite an audit." And he meant it, because he knew that a fight conducted in the daylight starved the parts of Victor that only fed at night. He called Maya. She answered on the second ring with a voice that still carried courtroom steel, and when he described the pattern, she said, "We'll walk the auditors through cash flow down to the Staples receipts." And then, softer, "Are the kids okay?" And he exhaled, because that was the only question that mattered. The audit came and went like an inspection of a clean kitchen. The report read boring, which is to say perfect. The smear receded, but Nicholas stored the lesson. Victor had stopped aiming at him and started aiming at what he loved. He did not sleep well for a week, not until he doubled the nest security quietly and hired a director who had never lost a child in her supervision in 20 years. On a Sunday that looked like every Sunday and therefore meant everything, Nicholas took Emily and Jack across the river to help repaint a community room. Jack's hair turned a shade of blue that would ruin the towel later, and Emily out-argued a foreman 3 times her size about how much light the new fixtures actually threw. And Nicholas watched them occupy the world as if it owed them place, not apology, and thought this is the miracle, not the boardroom victories or the court orders, but the hinge where children stop bracing and start insisting. He didn't tell them he was bracing again. The year review hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday, and though Emily had already decided he would come back from it, he knew better than to take returning for granted. He met Lena 2 days before the hearing at a coffee shop that had a corner table as private as a promise. She had a new nameplate at work and a competence that no longer flinched. Operations supervisor, and when she told him about a shift schedule she'd refused Because it punished mothers for being mothers, he felt pride that wasn't paternal and wasn't romantic, but was something better, respect. They talked through the plan Maya had drafted, the way overnight visits had expanded without the children's grades dipping, the way teachers had reported that the siblings no longer burst into tears when the bell rang at the end of the day. Lena traced her finger along the rim of her cup and said, "Do you ever get afraid that there's a version of this that doesn't end with everyone okay?" And he answered honestly, "Every day." And because neither of them were the kind of adult who lied to make a moment easier, they let the fear sit between them like a third chair, and then they fed it facts until it shrank. On the morning of the hearing, Jack wore a tie badly and refused to fix it properly because it's my luck knot, and Emily asked to bring the sheet music for a piece she wasn't ready to perform yet. They walked into a courtroom that had learned their names and no longer said them like a headline. The judge had the careful face of a man who knew children turn into adults who remember exactly how you behaved when you had power over them. The social worker's report was what Nicholas had prayed for, precise and boring again, boring like consistent meals and every report card on time. Lena's counselor spoke about her treatment plan and her promotion, about sobriety in the classical sense, not from substances, but from chaos. Maya presented the schedule both households proposed for the next year, and it was not a contest. It was a map that intentionally drew two houses on the same piece of paper. When it was Nicholas's turn, he did not talk about money or the logistics miracle his office had become. He talked about the exact size of Jack's laugh when he thought he'd fooled you, and the way Emily stopped breathing for the 2 seconds before she found a note she'd been chasing for days. Which is to say, he talked about knowing them, down to their idiosyncrasies, down to the muscle memory of their presence. The judge folded his hands and said what judges say when they've decided something long before they speak it aloud. The law favors stability, and stability has, by all evidence, lived with Mr. Hale while growing in Miss Reyes's home, using Lena's surname with a dignity she appreciated. He ordered shared legal custody to continue, primary placement with Nicholas during the school week, weekends rotating, and summers expanding at Lena's discretion as work permitted, with a clause that had not existed last year. Major decisions would be made at the same table, literally, with the children in the room when appropriate, because the court could enforce schedules, but only a family could enforce faith. No one cried until they were in the hallway. Then Jack did the crying for everyone, because 6 is still young enough to sob noisily into the jacket of the man who is teaching you what forever feels like. And Emily wiped her face with the heel of her hand and rolled her eyes at her own tears, which is what 9 looks like when you've decided you are more steel than water and resent being reminded you're both. That night, the piano learned the piece Emily had carried into court. It didn't matter that she wasn't ready that morning. She seemed to have been born ready for a fight but needed practice for celebration. And so they practiced celebration properly, with wrong notes and giggles, and Jack falling asleep under the bench, because that's where the sound felt safest. In the quiet after they had been carried to bed, Nicholas stood at the window and watched the city scrawl constellations in windows, and thought of the boy who had counted the lights in the ceiling of a shelter because counting was easier than hoping. He was still in there somewhere, and Nicholas had learned not to hate him for his suspicion, but to let him run the numbers until the evidence was undeniable. He didn't hear his phone on the first vibration. Grace left a message she would never have left if it had been about work. "I've found something," she said when he called back, "and I think you'll want it, but I'll say it carefully. Your sister's address is now a house with the chalk drawings on the sidewalk." He had seen his sister a few months earlier to apologize for a decade of explanations that were just synonyms for absence, but he had not brought the children, fearing he would be asking them to hold too much. Now he did. The next afternoon they arrived at a bungalow that had made peace with imperfection. The chalk on the walkway announced, "Welcome, friends, except mosquitoes." And when his sister opened the door, She smiled like a woman who remembered the boy version of the man in front of her and forgave him without ceremony. Aunt Liv? Jack tried the title cautiously, then liked how it tasted and tried it louder, and Olivia Hale laughed and said, "That's me." And it took 15 minutes for her living room to look like a family had been visiting there for years. Nicholas watched his past meet his present and did the arithmetic again. A little boy counting ceiling tiles, plus a little girl braiding a doll's hair on the carpet, plus a man who had built the kind of life that looked like a fortress but had decided to leave the drawbridge down. Sometimes the only way to protect is to invite more people in. The invitation was tested a week later when Victor Crane realized his patient bleed-out strategy had failed and attempted surgery, a late-night breach at a data vendor that serviced Hale Enterprises and several hospitals where the Nest had sponsored family rooms. It was not just corporate. It was surgical cruelty, calibrated to make Nicholas choose between his company and the families he insisted on sheltering. The breach team didn't get far. Nicholas paid for the best digital instincts the city had, and when his investigators followed the money, it took them to a labyrinth of shell companies where, inevitably, they found the greasy fingerprint of Brightshore Capital. The district attorney's office did the rest. Ridiculous men in good suits were led out of the elevators that smelled expensively neutral, and Victor watched other people write his ending. Nicholas did not go to the press conference. He took Emily to her recital instead. She wore black because she said it made her feel like a grown-up and because she'd read somewhere that concert pianists wore black to become the background to the music, and Nicholas suspected she also liked the cinematic, clean line of it. She did not win. She missed a run in the middle and recovered with so much grace that 2 judges marked her higher than the girl who had played without mistakes, and when they walked home with a participation ribbon folded like a joke in her pocket, Nicholas told her the closest thing to a sermon he had ever believed. Perfection is just fear in a tuxedo. What you did was better. She looked up at him and didn't smile. But the next evening she practiced the hard measure at half speed for 20 minutes, and that, he thought, is the real answer. It would have been an excellent time for the story to stay quiet, to settle into the now, but life refused neat arcs. Late in September, Lena collapsed at work. It wasn't dramatic, no sirens, no headline, just a woman whose body had been in a sprint for a decade, finally demanding she stop. The ER ruled out the emergencies and ruled in the reality: anemia, stress, dehydration, an ordinary crisis, which is to say the kind that kills quietly if you keep telling yourself you can push through. Nicholas took the kids to her, and the children climbed onto the hospital bed as if it were a couch, and the monitors were decorations. "I'm sorry," Lena whispered, and Emily said, "For what?" So sharply that Nicholas almost laughed, because this was the good kind of inheritance, the one where a girl learns from the adults in her life that apologies are not the currency of existence. They rearranged the next month without negotiation. Lena moved into Nicholas's guest room for 2 weeks, where the largest rebellion of her life turned out to be letting someone else fold her laundry. And Nicholas sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and drew the household like a supply chain. Then remembered, people don't like to be optimized, they like to be asked. And he scrapped the chart and asked instead. The answer was a new rhythm that left room for rest without calling it surrender. Meal trains from co-workers, ride shares preloaded into Lena's phone so she wouldn't insist on walking at midnight. A therapy slot that fit her calendar because care is logistics as much as it is courage. There was a night after the lights went out when Nicholas stood at her door and almost knocked, not because he wanted romance, but because he wanted to witness. He did not knock. Some silences are generosity. The next crisis did not ask for the door either. It kicked it off its hinges. Jack's school called with a phrase no parent wants: lockdown. It was a precaution, a threat just outside, the kind of proximity to harm that makes your blood cold because you can hear the ordinary world going on a block away. Nicholas arrived before the cordon even fully formed. Money can buy speed but not access, and stood on the wrong side of a line while his boy learned what a cupboard feels like when adults decide it is safer than open air. It was a false alarm, thank God, and when Jack came out, he didn't run so much as fold into him, which Nicholas would later realize was a different kind of running. They went home and did not talk right away, because terror metabolizes wordlessly at first. And then Jack said, matter-of-fact like weather, "Did you ever hide?" And Nicholas told the truth about the one time he climbed into a closet when his mother's boyfriend turned loud, and the way the darkness became a place he still sometimes walks into when a door slams too hard. "What do you do?" Jack asked, chin against his chest, and Nicholas said, "I name things in the room." And so they did, together, a ritual as ridiculous and holy as any prayer. Lamp, couch, rug, picture frame, something green that might be a dinosaur under the coffee table, until the world reassembled around them and they could breathe again. Autumn slid towards winter with fewer alarms, and in January, Nicholas discovered that the sound of a blender at 6 a.m. is one of the markers of a house that intends to live a long time. Emily had fallen in love with smoothies, and Jack had fallen in love with the mess they made. Work did not become less. Complicated. Networks and ports and grids remain networks and ports and grids, and men like Victor are hydra-headed. There will always be another. But Nicholas had learned to structure his day around a different axis, and on a morning when a storm iced the roads and the city canceled half its ambition, he took the kids to the airport. Not to fly, just to watch. They stood at the tall window and guessed destinations from liveries, and the announcement sounded like a church without pews, and Jack pressed his palm to the glass because he still half believed he could warm the planes with his hand. At gate 14, the row of chairs stood empty. Nicholas sat anyway. Emily leaned against him and rolled her eyes without malice at the sentimentality of it. Jack climbed into his lap because some ritual should not be aged out of. He did not expect the little girl with the red backpack. She walked the way children do when they're trying to impersonate patience, and only managed to impersonate grief. The man with her wore a suit that cost more than her courage, and kept looking at the board as if time might be persuaded to move faster if glared at emphatically. The girl's backpack zipper broke, and crayons spilled like bright mistakes. Nicholas did not think about symbolism. He crouched to help because you don't look away from what you've been. He handed the girl a blue crayon, and she said thank you like a test. "Do you like drawing?" he asked. She nodded, then whispered, "My mom says I'm not supposed to talk to strangers," and he said, "Your mom is right," and backed up 2 steps so the space could feel safe again. The man noticed him then, recognition flickering across a face that had seen him on magazine covers and had decided it knew him. "Mr. Hale," the man said, "big fan." And Nicholas nodded and kept his distance from both of them because it is possible to be a safe man and still understand the optics of your own power. He slipped Emily a look, and she slipped him one back, and they stayed until the gate called the flight, and the girl with the red backpack, now held closed by a borrowed hair tie, boarded with the man who might have been kind and might not have been. Not all stories announce their villains in leather. On the way home, he did not tell the children what he'd been thinking, because he did not want them to inherit his vigilance. He wanted them to inherit his readiness. At dinner that night, burnt grilled cheese, because he had tried to answer an email while butter melted in a pan. Emily said, "What happens if Lena meets someone?" with the clinical interest of an analyst, and Jack said, "Then we'll teach him the rules." And Nicholas laughed until he almost choked because he could picture it exactly. A man on the porch with a bouquet and a checklist administered by a 9-year-old who can read soul the way other people read room. He thought about marriages and arrangements and love that isn't a competition, and decided not to decide anything out loud. It was enough that the kitchen had 3 voices, and one of them was humming. In the spring, the adoption conversation breached the surface, not because he wanted to erase anything, but because the children wanted to add. Maya explained the law like a bridge, not a border. Lena listened, then answered in a sentence that cannot be improved. A last name is a place to stand, not a place to hide. They built something that fetched stares from people who like their families tidy and their guardianships unilateral. Lena remained their mother in the present tense. Nicholas became their legal father without annexing their history. And the paperwork read like the thing it was, a practical declaration of what had already been true in the kitchen and the car and the waiting rooms and the nightly inventory of stuffed animals. The day the judge signed, they celebrated not with champagne but with ice cream in a park where a boy lost his shoe in a fountain, where a woman argued with a squirrel like it was a landlord, where no one cared that a millionaire sat on a bench with mustard on his sleeve. Anonymity is what wealth cannot buy and what happiness often requires. When Emily fell asleep that night with the adoption certificate tucked under her pillow like a tooth she didn't want to trade for money, Nicholas sat at the piano and touched the keys the way you touch a sleeping child's hair, careful not to wake what you love. He did not play chopsticks. He played the measure in the middle of the piece, the one she had missed, and then practiced and then owned. And when he reached the hard part, he slowed until the notes were honest. The house breathed around him, the tick of the hallway clock, the distant hiss of the dishwasher, the almost silent shift of blankets in the next room. This is what he had wanted all along without knowing it, a life so loud with small sounds that the old silences no longer had anywhere to sit. It would not always be this quiet. Lawsuits would return, markets would buckle, people would fail one another because people always do. Love would be confused with control some days and with rescue on others, and he would have to keep learning the difference. But he had built an infrastructure that did not blink when lightning struck, a lattice of human beings who showed up when called even at 3 a.m, and that is wealth. Months later, at a gala he could not politely refuse, a man with an expensive laugh asked him if it had all been worth it, the hit to productivity, the risk to reputation, the loss of privacy. Nicholas didn't answer with a speech or a TED Talk line. He said, "My son left a dinosaur under the piano, and I didn't put it away for a week," and watched comprehension fail to land on a face that had never once in its life measured anything that mattered. He left early. He had a meeting at 3 a.m. with a cough in Jack's room, and he had found a kind of joy in moving the humidifier like a piece of equipment at a data center, because in the end, all he had ever been good at was keeping systems running, and this was the system that made the others worth anything at all. On a Thursday that looked like any other, Nicholas's phone buzzed with a text from Maya that read simply, "Crane pled, no trial." He showed no one the relief that flooded him, because victories that cost other people their careers feel complicated even when those people aimed at your children. He just made pancakes and got the ratio of batter to pan almost right. Later, walking the kids to school, they passed a street musician playing a battered trumpet, and Emily stopped to listen to a phrase that wasn't quite correct and nodded in approval anyway, because sometimes the note you almost hit is the one that tells the truth about how hard you're trying. Jack dropped 3 quarters into the open case and announced, "For the Dinosaur Fund," and the musician laughed and played them a goodbye that turned the morning into a movie for 11 seconds. At the corner, where the crossing guard knew their names, Nicholas looked down and saw 2 shadows braided into his and felt a quiet so complete it did not require silence. He squeezed the small hands in his and stepped into the world that had been waiting for him since an airport bench had reordered his understanding of what it means to live like a man who is truly rich.